I think y'all all will agree on at least this one thing. COVID sucks. We have all treated patients with it. We've known friends, family, and colleagues who have had it. We've worked overtime because of it, and many of us have had it ourselves. Now, vaccines were a real game changer, but we still need treatments for those breakthrough cases and the unvaccinated among us. Now, we've got drugs like steroids and remdesivir for in-hospital use. And then there were those monoclonal antibodies. Remember those things? They required IV administration, and it turns out they're just not holding up very well against these new strains of COVID. Now, what we need are oral medications that we can prescribe for outpatients and hopefully keep them from becoming inpatients. Now, Paxlovid, that has EUA approval based on a promising randomized controlled trial. But the patients in that trial were not vaccinated, and they were treated back when Delta was king. Now, I'm finding myself more and more in the situation of trying to decide whether to prescribe Paxlovid, even though the majority of my patients are vaccinated and Omicron has now displaced Delta. What all of us have been waiting for is a real-world study among patients like the ones we're seeing now to help inform our prescribing decisions. Fortunately, we've got just one of those hot off the presses from Israel. Stick around as we unpack Paxlovid.
What is a lighthouse? It is a tower with a bright light at the top, located at an important or dangerous place. The main purpose of a lighthouse is to serve as a navigational aid and to warn of dangerous areas. Welcome to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, illuminating the darkness of current EMS clinical practice with the bright light of science. Here's your host, Dr. Jeff Jarvis.
Howdy, y'all. I'm Dr. Jeff Jarvis. Welcome back to another episode of the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, the podcast where we bring the bright light of science to our EMS clinical practice. First off, I'd like to thank my friend Dr. Ben Abo for coming up with our catchy title, Unpacking Paxlovid. See what he did there? I was kind of floundering, and he came to my rescue. Thanks a lot, Ben. As always, really appreciate it. All right, let's jump right into this sea of Paxlovidness, shall we? Well, first, let's start talking about what Paxlovid actually is. Turns out it's a combination drug. The actual drug, well, the antiviral drug, that's Nirmatrelvir. And I'm probably mispronouncing this. Let me try one more time. Nirmatrelvir. There we go. Nirmatrelvir. Thank God for trade names. Nirmatrelvir. Well, Nirmatrelvir, it's an antiviral drug that is active against the M-Pro protease enzyme. What is an M-Pro enzyme, you ask? Well, it's an enzyme that's necessary for viral replication, but as far as we know, that protease enzyme is specific to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. That means it's unlikely to act on other targets, which hopefully will result in fewer adverse events. Unfortunately, this drug is rapidly metabolized by the cytochrome P450 3A4 enzyme. Now, if cytochrome P450 sounds familiar, well, that's because it should be. It is the enzyme that is involved in metabolizing many different medications. Now, because Nirmatrelvir is so rapidly metabolized, another drug, ritonavir, is added to block the P450 enzyme and allow Nirmatrelvir to stick around long enough to have an effect. Ritonavir has no impact on COVID other than increasing the bioavailability of Nirmatrelvir. The drug is packaged together as 300 milligrams of Nirmatrelvir and 100 of ritonavir. Now, unfortunately, because of ritonavir's actions, any drug metabolized by P450 is also affected, and that is a lot of common drugs. And because these are so common, let me go through just a couple of them. Aspirin, atenolol, carvedilol, Lasix, lisinopril, hydrochlorothiazide, Effient, azithromycin, Now here's an irony alert. Hydroxychloroquine, boy, doesn't that put you in a bind. Benadryl, insulin, metformin, prednisone, pravastatin, citalopram, fluoxetine, sertraline, Tylenol, ibuprofen, codeine, oral contraceptives, Lovenox, and Zofran. And that's just a few of those. Added to that, Paxlovid is renally cleared, like I mentioned before, and you got to adjust the dose if your kidney function is bad. And our definition of that is under 30 mils per minute of GFR, that is. Now, I treat a lot of these older patients with lots of comorbidities, and I bump into these contraindications all the time. I end up using another drug that has EUA approval, Molnupiravir. It's not as effective as Paxlovid, but I can use it because it doesn't have these contraindications. But there are still lots of patients out there who don't have contraindications. So what's the evidence that Paxlovid works? Well, let's start with a quick review of the original Pfizer-supported study. EPIC-HR was a multinational randomized placebo-controlled trial among unvaccinated adults with symptomatic but not hospitalized COVID who were over the age of 18 and had at least one risk factor for progressing to severe COVID. Patients had to have had onset of symptoms and a positive COVID test within 5 days of randomization, preferably 3. Patients were excluded if they've had COVID before, if they were felt likely to need hospitalization within the next 48 hours, or if they had been treated with convalescent plasma or vaccinated. And that last part, that's really important. Vaccinated patients were specifically excluded. That's a big deal for interpreting this paper in a time when many of our patients are vaccinated. The primary outcome of the study was efficacy, and they measured it as the incidence of patients requiring hospitalization or dying from any cause within the first 28 days after randomization. Secondary outcomes were about safety and adverse events. Well, let's skip the rest of the details and get right into the juicy results. The treatment and placebo groups were well matched, as you would expect from an RCT, and the money shot, if you will, of this paper, it's in figure 2. Take a look. It is a Kaplan-Meier curve comparing the incidence of severe COVID or death between these two groups over time. Now, the bottom line is an incident rate of 0.72% of severe COVID or death in the Paxlovid group versus 6.53% in the placebo group. That's an absolute difference of 5.8% less. And the confidence interval goes from -7 to -3.84, meaning it is statistically significant. Now, there were 9 deaths in the overall trial, and they were all in the placebo group. The relative risk reduction, which of course is what Pfizer is going to talk about because it's so impressive, and it is impressive, 88.9% relative risk reduction of really bad things with Paxlovid. The adverse events were statistically similar in both groups for most things. There were a couple that were more common with Paxlovid. Those were altered taste in just under 5% and diarrhea in about 1.3%. So I mentioned before that they talked about a relative risk reduction of 88.9%. People like to use relative risk reductions because they sound more impressive. I'm sort of an absolute risk reduction sort of guy, and that turns out to be pretty good too. It's 5%. So a 5% absolute risk reduction in hospitalization or death, that's a good deal. But I have to caution, these were unvaccinated patients who had Delta. And then there's this other thing. We always need to be a bit skeptical of industry-supported trials. I don't mean reject them out of hand, but just be cautious. Maybe look for independent real-world evidence to support that initial industry trial, which is why I've been going a bit slowly prescribing Paxlovid. Fortunately, we just got a wonderful study from Israel that makes me way more comfortable prescribing Paxlovid. The title of this paper is Effectiveness of Paxlovid in Reducing Severe Coronavirus Disease 2019 and Mortality in High-Risk Patients. It was published in Clinical Infectious Diseases June 2nd, 2022, just a couple weeks ago. The lead author was Dr. Najjar-Debbiny, and the senior author was Dr. Walid Saliba. And please forgive me if I massacred the pronunciation of your names. So this was an observational study using the electronic medical records data from the largest HMO in Israel, Claylet Health. And they combined that with databases specifically on COVID from their Ministry of Health. Now, Claylet covers just under 5 million patients and includes both primary care and hospital care. The basic methodology was to group all adults over 18 who tested positive for COVID and had at least one comorbidity that put them at high risk for severe COVID. We got all of those people together. Now, they used similar inclusion criteria as the EPIC-HR study, in terms of comorbidities, but they did not exclude patients who were vaccinated. And this is a critical difference that really makes it more useful for me because, again, most of my patients are vaccinated. In this trial, over 75% of patients in the group that got Paxlovid and the group that did not were vaccinated. In order to avoid enrolling those with severe COVID, they excluded those who were diagnosed in the hospital or who were felt to be likely to need admission on the day of diagnosis. The trial looked at patients diagnosed between January and February of 2022, this year, and that was a time when Omicron was the dominant strain in Israel. Well, they started with 180,000 eligible patients who tested positive for COVID, and then they went backwards into the EMR and figured out who got Paxlovid and who didn't. There were 4,737 patients who got Paxlovid in the first 5 days of their test, and they compared those to 175,000 patients who did not get it. Now, the two groups are obviously going to be different because of indication. Paxlovid should only be prescribed for those at high risk of disease progression. Because of this, it shouldn't be surprising that those that were treated with Paxlovid were more likely to be older and male and have higher socioeconomic status. Might be a little surprising, but they were also more likely to be Jewish as opposed to Orthodox Jewish or Arab, which is the way they broke down their grouping. But they were also more likely to have other comorbidities. Crude incident rates of severe COVID were 5.6 per thousand in the control group that didn't get Paxlovid, and that is compared to 10.4 per thousand in the Paxlovid group. That's right, there was more severe COVID and death in the group that got Paxlovid. And if you want to put your tinfoil hat on and run to the conspiracy, you should probably stop listening right now. But if you want to take a deep breath and understand it, this is exactly what we would expect because the two groups were not equal. It was not a randomized controlled trial. This is an observational trial. Of course, the two groups were not equal. The one who got Paxlovid is going to be sicker because Paxlovid is indicated for those who are sicker. And that's why crude rates are not the key thing to look at here. What we need to do is adjust for these baseline differences between these two groups. And of course, that's exactly what they did. So they ran an adjusted model and they calculated the hazard ratio for severe COVID or death with Paxlovid versus control, and their hazard ratio was 0.54 with a confidence interval of 0.39 to 0.75. That means there was a 46% lower risk of progressing to severe COVID or dying with Paxlovid. In other words, after adjusting for those baseline differences that we talked about, even after considering vaccination status, Paxlovid was associated with a lower risk of getting really sick, and that is exactly what we want to see. Now, interestingly, they were also able to calculate the adjusted hazard ratio for getting severe COVID or dying based on vaccination status after adjusting for Paxlovid. What did they find there? An 80% reduced odds of severe COVID. Their hazard ratio was 0.20 with a confidence interval of 0.17 to 0.22. Now, if I had to choose between being vaccinated or getting Paxlovid once I got COVID, I'm going to get vaccinated any day of the week. I like an 80% reduced risk better than a 46% reduced risk. I'm going to go with vaccination. Fortunately, this is not an either-or situation. We can all get vaccinated, and then, assuming we're at high risk, we can take Paxlovid if we get COVID. Now, they did a lot of additional analysis, which really isn't probably worth digging into here, but I really would encourage you to read the paper. And the one point I'll make is about figure 3. Be sure you take a look at that. It's a forest plot that shows the effectiveness of Paxlovid broken down by a bunch of different risk factors, and it shows that Paxlovid is beneficial in most groups, it's not harmful in any group, and the most helpful in those with more comorbidities. All right, so how am I going to use these two papers when it comes to my prescribing habits? Well, after the first paper came out, like I said, I was cautiously optimistic. Cautious because it was an industry-supported study, and cautious because it was done in a population that didn't look like mine. They were unvaccinated and they had Delta. Well, now that I've seen this real-world trial that confirms the initial trial, but was done among patients that look like mine, I am way more likely to prescribe Paxlovid. In fact, I've been writing lots more prescriptions during my last couple of shifts. Now, I'm also writing a lot more Molnupiravir as a backup because of all those contraindications. But I'm still writing a fair amount of Paxlovid. Now, I recently had COVID, but that was before this paper was published. And by some means, I could be considered high risk because I'm 54 and I have hypertension. Overall, though, I think I'm at pretty low risk. And maybe I'm delusional, but I didn't take Paxlovid then, and I probably wouldn't take it if I get COVID again. Now, on the other hand, I'm absolutely going to recommend that my mother take it if she gets COVID. She is obviously older than me, and she has some comorbidities. I would recommend it for her. And I'd also recommend it to some of my older paramedic colleagues, and definitely some of those colleagues who are immunosuppressed. Guys, I truly hope that this information rapidly becomes pointless because COVID just goes away. Unfortunately, I've been hoping that a really long time, and it ain't happened yet. But at least now we have another helpful tool in our toolbox. If y'all found this episode helpful, please give me a thumbs up on YouTube or a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcast. Please subscribe and tell your friends about it. It really does help us. Guys, please stay safe, and thank you for all you do. Take care, y'all.
You've been listening to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, a proud member of the FlightBridge Ed podcast family and a Fire Dog production. Visit flightbridgeed.com for more information.